straws. Good morning and welcome to Waypoint. And if you're joining us via computer, online church, welcome to you as well. We're in week 4 of David. Don't worry, we're going to catch you up in case you've missed some of the messages. It's a really practical message from Andy. We're going to be looking at what it looks like when you've got authority, when you've got power. How should you behave and treat other people within that context? So a very practical message for us this morning that we're really excited about. What you saw there just now was the promotion for the couples conference. Why that's important to us and why we're hosting that is because we know that marriages and family units are the first place where we start building community. And that's the first place where we get a text on that relationship. So what we do is we press in to help strengthen those relationships, help set families up for success. And that's for people that are married, newly married, been married for a few years, and also people that are looking at starting a relationship. So even if you haven't found that right person, this might be you investing in yourself, getting yourself ready for that relationship. And why it's relevant? Just to share a few practical things with you. Within the regional court that serves the greater Nelson Mandela Metro, there are 20 cases of divorce daily for our area. That's 100 cases on average in a week. And as a faith community, we're not okay with that. So we need to do something to change what we see is happening around us. Because the reality is if we don't fight against that, that's exactly where we're heading. To give you an idea of what's cited as the most common reasons for these relationships coming under strain and crumbling is lack of meaningful communications, interests not being shared, family involvement, verbal and physical abuse, and infidelity. And part of what we're doing is looking at these issues and helping our relationships strengthen so that communication can be better. Because at the core, that's what is at the foundation of that. So join us next Saturday for that. You've got information on your seats for the Heads versus Heart Couples Conference. In terms of this morning, if you're new here, the toilets are at the back on your right-hand side behind you if you need that. Coffee is at the back. We're going to have coffee at the end as well, so you didn't miss out if you came in just now. And we'd love to chat to you. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask us that at the end over coffee. In terms of what's going to come up, you can sit back and relax because nothing weird is going to happen. I'm going to hand over to Jean in a second, and something great's going to happen because he's going to lead us in a few songs. If you feel comfortable enough to sing with us, then feel free, join in. After that, we're going to introduce Zola. Zola, talk to you about Zola. Jacques is going to introduce that. We're going to do giving for the people that are prepared, and we're going to head into week 4 of David with Andy Stanley, and then at the end, I'm going to close for us, and that's going to be us together, just over an hour. Right, so it's my privilege to introduce you guys to Jean.
Thank you, Dirk. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Ek so bly julle is almal hierso. If you're new here, I want you to be very comfortable, and like Dirk said, nothing will be required from you. You can sit back and relax. We're going to sing a few songs, but first, I just want you to practice your Afrikaans a bit. So look to the guy next to you and tell him, jy's glad nie sleg nie, jy's lekker. I say, cool. Jy's lekker. Cool, guys. You can stand with us, and we're going to sing a few songs. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
that the highest king would welcome me. I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Oh, the sun sets free. Oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was just a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. My Father's house. There's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am. The sun sets free, all is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am. The sun sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. My Father's house. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Thank you, Dad, that we have refrigerator rights. Thank you that you are so kind enough that we can be calling you Dad, that we can be comfortable around you, that we can trust that what you did was good enough for us.
thank you for what you've done for us. We thank you for paying a price we couldn't pay to give us a relationship that we couldn't go without. We thank you for your love. We thank you that you're here with us. Amen.
Good morning, Waypoint. It's actually such a privilege to be part of a community, and every Sunday I look so forward to just seeing everybody and greeting and saying hi. So, Lungiswe and Zola, not Zola, it's not Zola, but Zola Moses is, it's my privilege to introduce Zola and Lungiswe and their children, which I'll try and pronounce all the names just now. I wrote them down, and Zola gave me a bit of a pre-lecture. But maybe the question of why the privilege of introducing Zola and his family to you this morning, and maybe it's something that I need to share, and this is it, that not only have we been praying to God about how do we bridge the cultural barriers, how do we bring unity into the body, and how do we get in Waypoint where our hearts for the next generation and our children's children is, and the reason we set up the environments, and the reason we are busy looking at a new venue with some exciting stuff, is that we want to really get to a point where we represent our community and start impacting a community, the nation, the world for Jesus. So Zola and I met one another, and our hearts just touched. The Holy Spirit just touched us, and we became brothers, and we've just been spending time together. And it's really been through this interaction that the roads came together, and it's my privilege to introduce Zola and his family to the staff of Waypoint. Zola's whole purpose in this, he's got 5 objectives, but I think the fundamental purpose is that there's so much mistrust in the world. There's so much mistrust racially in our communities, in our country. And it's our dream, and with you and your blessings, because of your giving, it is possible that we together are taking hands to shift and show people what happens when people under God comes together. So it is such an important thing for us that we will bridge the racial of the past and the differences. And when we, as white guys, go and we invite black people, there's a mistrust. And Zola and I am going to try and work together with the staff and with you to bridge those mistrusts and to break the chains of lies and deceit that the enemy has brought in our country and our community. So really welcome. Help me to welcome them as part of our team that's going to help us walk in obedience to where the Holy Spirit is leading us. Also, when we go into our new venue and we're going to look at starting a college and education programs to bring and uplift our community and make an impact in our community. It doesn't help us just to preach about God. It is important for us to live what He's called us to do. So, welcome so much, and I'm going to try and introduce the kids. So if the photos goes up, so Sianda is 19, so they've got a bigger family than I. Luso is 13. Otkongiweyo is 7, and Unika is 4. So please help welcome them a Waypoint welcome. You want to say something?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm on the spotlight here, so I'm not going to speak much. Thank you very much for having us. We're looking forward to working with you guys. Just a little bit of interpretation, maybe. Otongiweyo is the most difficult name out of the 4.
Yes.
And it simply means the chosen one.
Oh.
Otongiweyo is the chosen one. And Onika, the last born, is a giver.
Okay.
That's basically what it means. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Week 4 of David. What to do when we're in a position of authority. What does that look like? And what is, importantly, God called us to represent when we're in that. And part of getting ready for this message, helping you get an overview of what's happened, what we looked at last week, we've got the youth band playing with the title track of this morning's message. So let's get a recap on what has happened.
David was responsible for the death of an entire village. And David is broken. Very few people escape the slaughter. Because taking matters into our own hands, sometimes it feels good. It just doesn't turn out good. This is our best opportunity to be like our Father in heaven. Again, it's how our story intersects. It's how our story intersects with the greatest story ever told. And the greatest story ever told is God returning good for evil. God giving his son for our sin. That's the gospel. And if you're a Christian, that's your story.
Oh, Father, tell me, do we get what we deserve? Oh, we get what we deserve. And way down we go. And way down we go. Say way down we go. Say way down we go. Oh, you let your feet up. Time has come as we all go down. Yeah, but before the fall, my life, do you dare to look you right in the eye? 'Cause they will burn you down, down to the toe. Yes, and they will burn you down, down to your fall. Yeah, and then they will burn you down, down to your core. Yeah, so you can't crawl no more. And way down we go, 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 go. Say way down we go. Say way down we go. 'Cause they will burn you down, down to your fall. Way down. Way down we go. Way down we go. Way down we go. 'Cause they will burn you down, down to your floor. Way down we go. And way down we go. And way down we go. Way down we go.
Nice, guys.
Now, I think that perhaps the greatest measure of an individual's maturity, the greatest measure of an individual's maturity, the greatest measurement perhaps of your maturity is how we handle authority, how we handle power, how we handle influence. In other words, how we respond when it dawns on us that we are the most important person or we're the most powerful person in the room. Whether it's the boardroom, the classroom, the locker room, whether you're at work, it may be at home with your family, but at any moment, at any time when it dawns on you, all eyes are on me, that I'm the one in charge, I get to make the decision, I'm the most powerful person in the room. What you do in that moment says so much about you, and what I do in that moment says so much about me, because the greatest, perhaps, reflection of our individual maturity is what we do with our influence, what we do with power, what we do with authority. And few things are more disturbing, I think you would agree, few things are more disturbing than when you see somebody with power or influence or authority and they leverage it for their benefit to the neglect of the people that they're responsible for, to the neglect of the people that have chosen to follow them. But at the same time, there are few things more inspiring than a leader who has some sort of influence or some sort of authority, who says yes to herself, who says no to herself or no to himself. In other words, they say no to something they could embrace for the sake of the people that they're responsible for, the people that have chosen to follow them. I mean, some of our favorite stories are the men or the women of influence or power, whether it's a politician or somebody we've worked for, or somebody that we work with, or maybe one of our parents. And they said no to themselves so they could say yes to us or yes to the people who've chosen to follow them. Now, my theory is this, that none of us really know which lever we would pull. None of us really know what button we would push until somebody actually hands us the keys, until somebody actually gives us the position. We won't really know which way we go with this until we actually have the authority. Or in David's case, until we get the crown. Now, when David was a little boy, I say a little boy, actually he was in middle school. When David was in middle school, Samuel, the prophet, who was kind of the authority other than King Saul, showed up at his home, and he wasn't home that day, he was working. And Samuel the prophet showed up in his home, and he said to David's father, Jesse, he said, I'm here on a mission, but as we would discover later, it was a secret mission. And the reason it was a secret mission is because Samuel's mission was to anoint the next king of Israel. And the reason it was a secret is because Israel already had a what? Yeah, they already had a king. So if you're going to anoint the next one, there's already one. You better keep your mission a secret. So he shows up, and he doesn't even tell Jesse why he's there. He says, Jesse, I've come here to do a special sacrifice. I want you to invite all of your family to this special sacrifice. And the idea was this, that Samuel thought, as soon as I see the son of Jesse that's going to be the next king, I'm going to get the God nod, or the nod from God. I'm just going to know that this is the guy, okay? So Jesse invites all of his family to this special sacrifice, and Samuel's kind of, scanning the crowd to try to figure out which one of these folks is going to be the next king. And the text says this, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab, which was Jesse's oldest son, which was his firstborn, and you kind of go with the firstborn in a situation like this. And he thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. He thought, this was easy. Firstborn, first kid. I mean, we don't even have to do the sacrifice. Game over. I got this figured out. But you may have remembered this story from childhood. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance, which is very difficult to do, right? I mean, when you meet somebody, the first thing you notice is it's not their IQ, for sure, right? It's not their manners. First thing you notice is the way a person looks. And all of us, even in ancient times, ascribe value and ascribe sometimes authority and influence to people who look good. And God says, Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Why? Because the Lord, we learned something important here. The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance. Yes, they do. Yes, we do. The people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. In other words, it's what's in a man that makes a man. So ladies, don't be fooled by that outward appearance, right? And it's what's in a woman that makes the woman. So men, never mind, you're hopeless. Anyway, so the story goes on. I just want to keep it real. Six sons later, and catch this, 6 sons later, still no king. I mean, all the sons are there, they're starting to sacrifice, and Samuel's looking around like, maybe I missed something. And so he finally says to Jesse, imagine this awkward moment, Jesse, are these all the sons you have? I mean, I asked you to invite the whole family. Is this everybody? I mean, what a silly question. If you ask somebody to invite the family, and Jesse looks around and he realizes, oh yeah, no, this isn't everybody. They're still the youngest. Jesse answered, "He's tending the sheep." And Samuel said, "Send for him right now. We're not going to sit down until he arrives." And when David shows up, little shepherd boy David, who's probably 13 or maybe 14 years old, Samuel gets the nod. God says to Samuel, however God said it, he is the one. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." And then this strange thing happens where Samuel walks over to middle school David and pours oil on his head and gives him a blessing, packs up his stuff, and leaves. And the whole family's standing there like, what just happened? Because there's no indication that Samuel told Jesse what he anointed David to do. But here's what we know. Since he was a little boy, since he was a middle schooler, David knew God had something special for him. And about 18 months from that moment, or maybe 2 years later, is when he kills Goliath. He becomes an overnight sensation. And then for the next 7 years, David is in the good graces of the kingdom. David is in the good graces of the king. In fact, King Saul marries off one of his daughters to David. He becomes best friend with the king's oldest son, who's going to be the next king, Jonathan. For 7 years, things are great. Then as we saw last week, Saul gets threatened. He gets jealous. He tries to kill David. He puts a bounty on his head. And David becomes a fugitive from the law for 8 years. So for the next 8 years, David is on the run, hiding with his band of merry men, trying not to side with the Philistines, but at the same time, trying to stay away from King Saul and everyone who supports King Saul. All the while knowing God had chosen him for something special. And all the while, if you read through this incredible detailed narrative, all the while learning some extraordinarily important lessons. And perhaps the most important lesson that David learned in the wilderness years was this lesson, that it's not about me. It's not about me. It's God's will, God's way, and God's time. It's God's will and God's way and God's time. It's God's will, God's way, in God's time. And the interesting thing too, and the narrative is so fascinating, on 2 occasions, and you know one of these probably if you grew up in church, on 2 occasions David has an opportunity to kill King Saul. One of them is a famous occasion where David is hiding in a cave and King Saul's men are passing by, and David's gonna wait for King Saul's men to pass by, then he'll come out of the cave with his men and they'll go in the other direction. And right in front of the cave where David is hiding, King Saul has to go to the bathroom. I think it's one of the only references in the entire Bible to go into the bathroom. Anyway, Saul, it's a great story if you teach or lead middle school ministry. Anyway, so Saul has to go to the bathroom. He stops, he gets off his donkey. You may know the story. He goes in the cave. David's hiding in the cave with his men. Their eyes have adjusted. Saul's eyes have not. Saul stops in the mouth of the cave just beyond the point where anybody outside could see and begins to do his business. He is in like the most vulnerable position possible, and all of David's men turn to him and say, and these are my words, not theirs, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding? God just delivered your enemy into your hands." In fact, here's what the text says. Then the men with David said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you," because David had said to them, "Guys, hang with me, stick with me. Things are tough now, but things are gonna get better. God has something special for me. I'm not sure what it is, but just stay with me. This is the day that you've told us about, David, when you said, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" And David almost falls for this. And you may remember the story. He creeps up on King Saul. He's about to kill King Saul and then, walk out of the cave victorious, knowing that everyone in Saul's army would immediately capitulate and declare David king. And as David is about to kill King Saul, he realizes, no. I have already done this wrong once. I have already learned this lesson the hard way. I will not take matters into my own hands. Saul finishes, goes, he gets on his donkey, they're about to leave, and David appears in the mouth of the cave. And everybody in Saul's army knows he could have taken the king's life, and he chose not to. But David is a bit mischievous, as we're about to find out, and he walks out to the mouth of the cave and he says, "Yoo-hoo." I don't think that's what he said, but basically he got everybody's attention. And he said, "Hey, Saul, and everybody looks, and there's David. May the Lord judge between you and me. I'm not gonna be the judge. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. Although everybody behind me and in front of me knows I have every right to take your life, to defend my own." Then there's another story that's not so popular. A few months later, Saul and his army are in the desert of Ziph. It's just a wide open plain with rolling hills. There were virtually no trees. And David had sent spies out to track, Saul's progress. He always wanted to know where Saul was so he could stay away from Saul. And the report comes back to him that they're in the desert of Ziph and they're camped out for the night. And David just cannot resist. So he takes a group of men up over a hill to watch the camp, to see the camp where King Saul is. The sun goes down. King Saul did what kings always do. He put his tent, or he decided to spend the night right in the middle of his army. He's completely surrounded by about 3,000 men. His spear is in the ground by his head because that's how they slept. And as the sun went down, David couldn't resist. And he turns to his friend Abishai and he says, Abishai, I have a really bad idea. Would you be willing to join me in my really bad idea? And Abishai says yes. So here's what happens. So David and Abishai went down into Saul's army at night. They go into the army at night, and there was Saul laying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head, because that's what they did. Abner, who was the chief of the king's bodyguards, he was the one responsible for protecting King Saul. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him, and Abishai said to David, but I think he whispered. So they have crept past the guards right into the middle of Saul's camp. I mean, what were they thinking? And Abishai whispers into David's ear, God has delivered your enemies into your hands. Now, we missed this opportunity once, okay? Now's the time to power up. Now's the time to take what's yours. God wills it, God wills it, God wills it. How else can we explain the fact that we are standing in the middle of King Saul's army, and no one has detected us, and we are standing next to sleeping King Saul? And then Abishai says, now look, David, I know you got all these religious convictions. You can't lay your hand on the Lord's anointed, but God hasn't told me I can't. Now, let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. In other words, David, okay, I know you're all freaked out over the fact that he's the king. Just let me kill him, and I won't mangle his body. Imagine it, David. I'll take his spear right through the heart. His eyes are wide open, and the last person he sees in this life is your face. And I'm telling you, David, when this army wakes up, they will declare you king. You see, this is why you should read the Bible. It's like, wow, and I'm skipping some of the parts. Okay, you just read this. But David whispered to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? I refuse. This is so big for us. I refuse to violate the will of God in order to gain the blessing of God and the blessings of God. I will not violate the will of God to gain the promise of God. I'm not going to violate the will of God to get what I deserve. This is not about me. However, let's have a little fun. And he says to Abishai, take Saul's spear, I'll take his water jug, and they creep out of camp, and they go up on a hillside, and they wait for the sun to rise. And as the sun is coming up and they are a silhouette, David just cannot resist the temptation. And he begins to yell out from the hillside, Abner, Abner, Abner. Now, Abner is chief of King Saul's bodyguard. Abner, Abner, are you missing anything? And everybody recognizes David's voice, and they look, and there he is silhouetted, and he's holding up a spear, and it looks like he's holding up a water jug. And Abner looks around, and King Saul's spear is missing, and his water jug is missing. And David shouts out, you are a poor excuse for a bodyguard. I came in the middle of the night and took the king's spear, which means I could have killed the king. Abner, you deserve to die for being such a poor excuse for a bodyguard. And then David and his men melt into the desert because David refused. David refused to replace what God had put in place. David refused to replace what God had put in place. Why? God's will, God's way, and God's time. It's got to be God's will, God's way, and God's time. Well, eventually, I'm skipping a lot. Eventually, King Saul and his son Jonathan are killed by the Philistines in battle. The two men that stood in the way of David becoming the king. And the interesting thing is the text tells us that David actually mourned the deaths of King Saul and Jonathan, the two men that stood in the way of becoming king. When they died, instead of throwing a party, he mourns their death. And so the tribe of Judah, Israel had 12 tribes. The tribe of Judah, which was the tribe David was from, they declare him king. But a fellow named Ishbosheth, who is one of King Saul's other sons, he declares himself king. So Ishbosheth, he claims to be king over 11 tribes. David is now king over one tribe. And for 7 more long years, there's a conflict between the house of David and the house of King Saul. Then eventually, and throughout this conflict, David essentially just tries to stay out of the way, and people continually say to David, claim what is yours, claim what is yours, claim what is yours. And over and over and over, David is no. It's God's will, God's timing, God's way. I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed, and if Ishbosheth has been declared king by those 10 or 11 tribes, then he's king. I just need to stay out of his way. 7 years this goes on. And then finally, 2 brothers sneak into Ishbosheth's house while he's taking a nap, and they murder him in his sleep. And they think they've done a great thing for David because now, think about it, they have removed the last obstacle to David being able to be king, becoming king over the entire nation of Israel. And so they cut off Ishbosheth's head and they take it to David to receive their reward and to give him the good news. That last obstacle has been removed. Here's what the text says. It says they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and they said to the king, here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. Now, one little, couple little bit of information about beheadings. Okay, this is interesting. You can use this somewhere. The Old Testament is full of beheadings. In fact, all of ancient times were full of beheadings. And when we read these stories, we think, how gory and how gruesome. But here's why they beheaded people. They didn't have iPhones. Okay, this is why. Nobody had a camera. The only way to prove that someone was dead, I'm gonna make this rhyme so you can remember it. The only way to prove that someone was dead was to show up somewhere with their head. Okay, that was the only way you could prove someone was dead. I mean, the only other option is to lug the entire body around. So who wants to do that? So the only way to prove that Ishbosheth was in fact dead was to take his head. Thank you. So you got that. So they cut off his head, throw it in a bag, they show up and they present it to David expecting that they're going to get a reward because they have removed the last obstacle to David becoming the king of the entire nation. So they present the head, they're so excited, they're elbowing each other in the ribs like, this is the day, anyway. And David answered, Rechab and his brother Baanah, as surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, as surely as the Lord lives, who has, as in the Lord has delivered me out of every trouble, as surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, the Lord who didn't need your help and didn't ask for your help. When someone told me that Saul is dead and thought he was bringing me good news, I seized him and put him to death. I skipped that part of the story. That was the reward I gave him for his news. And now they're not so happy. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house, at which point the people around David are saying, how can you say Ishbosheth is an innocent man? He was claiming the kingdom that belongs to you. But in David's mind, that's not how he thought. It's God's will, God's way, in God's time. How much more than when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own bed and house, on his own bed? So David gave an order, and his men, and they killed both of the brothers. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and they buried it, which was a sign of honor. They buried his head in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Well, after Ishbosheth was dead, and after his demise, the other 11 tribes finally declared for David. And at last, finally, he would become the king of the entire nation. After being a fugitive for 8 years, after being at war for 7 more years with the house of Saul, the text says this, that all the tribes, not just Judah, but all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, we are your own flesh and blood. They went on, in the past, while Saul was king over us, you are the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. David, we all know who had the influence. We all know who had the power. We all knew who deserved to be the king. And the Lord said to you, we know that the Lord said to you that you will shepherd my people Israel and you will become their ruler. This was no mystery. Everybody understood that David was destined to be king. They just couldn't understand why he didn't just grab it, why he didn't just seize the throne when he had so many opportunities. And when all the elders of Israel from all 12 tribes, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron to crown him, to hand him the power, in this moment, David shows his true greatness. In this moment, David applies everything he's learned in the wilderness. In this moment, he shows extraordinary maturity he would not have had at 15 or 20, or as we saw, certainly not at 22. But the difficult lessons he'd learned hiding and running from King Saul, in this moment, he would apply them and he would show his greatness. Think about this. They're about to hand him the power. He's holding all the cards. His word is law. He already has the influence. He's the most powerful person in the room, even without the crown. And in this moment, the text tells us that King David made a covenant with them at Hebron. Now, a covenant, in our way of thinking, is like a contract. A covenant in this context is, I'll do this if you'll do this, and if you'll do this, I'll do this. It was an arrangement, it was an agreement that King David made promises to the people, and this was completely unnecessary. He did not need to do this. He was now the king. His word was law. So why in the world, after being mistreated all those years, and again, he is facing a group of elders who did not support him when he was on the run. He could have exacted vengeance on every single one of the elders except for those who were part of the tribe of Judah, but he didn't. Instead, he made a covenant with this people. Why? And the last three words of the text explain it all. And this is the point of this story. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, he made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And in this moment, this is so powerful, in this moment, David recognized in public that he would be a king under authority. In this moment, he submitted himself to God's law, which meant as a leader, he was submitting himself to the people over which he would rule. This was his way of saying that I am a king, I am not the king. Because as we said in the first part of this series, with all of David's ups and downs and with all of his flaws, David never confused himself with the king of Israel. And they anointed him king over Israel. And David was 30 years old, and he reigned over Israel for 40 years. Now, we're gonna pick the story up right there next week and take it to the end. You're not gonna wanna miss next week. But here's the point. David waited, this is amazing. David waited 15 years for God to give him what he had been promised. That David waited, and not an easy 15 years. David waited 15 years for God to give him what he had promised. And during that time, he learned the extraordinary lessons that would make him a good and right king. He learned that leadership is always a stewardship, and that even kings are accountable. And while this is very inspiring, I think if you're a leader, or if you're a boss, or if you're an aspiring leader, certainly you read this story, and again, I've skipped a lot of details. When you read this story, there's something very inspiring about it. But here's the thing. It is really not enough for us to be inspired. If you're a Christian, this kind of great is actually required. It's an inspiring story. And in fact, if you're not a believer, if you're not a Christian, what an incredible story. And again, there's so much more to it. And it is inspiring. Whenever we watch someone do the right thing, as I said up front, whenever we see a leader say no to themselves so they can say yes to the people they're leading, it's always inspiring. But if you're a Jesus follower, if you're a Christian, it's not enough for us to be inspired. That kind of greatness is actually required. And here's why I say that. And this is so cool. 1,000 years later, imagine that. It's impossible for us to imagine. 1,000 years later, 20 miles north of Hebron, 20 miles north of where all this took place, in the city of Jerusalem, Jesus would model this kind of greatness in the most unusual way, but there would be a twist. And here's what happened. John, who was there, who was an eyewitness of all these things, who lived to be an old man and gives us some of the greatest literature about Jesus, most of which became part of our New Testament. John, who was there, here's what he wrote about this incredible moment when Jesus modeled what David modeled, but Jesus modeled it with a twist. It was just before Passover, and the Passover festival, of course, is when the Jewish people would celebrate annually the moment or the time when God led the nation out of Egyptian slavery. This was a big, big celebration for Jewish people and continues to be for many Jewish people today. And Jesus, during this Passover, this would be his last Passover with his disciples. He's gathered in what's referred to as the upper room, this special room where they would meet for the Passover meal. And so they're finishing up the Passover meal, and John, who would, John, I'm sure, who would interview all of this detail out of Jesus later, because what happened in this next moment was so fascinating. John, who was there, says this, that somehow Jesus knew in this moment that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Jesus knows that in just a few hours, he's gonna be arrested. He's gonna be tried. He's gonna be crucified. This is after being chased all over Judea and all over Galilee for the last 3 years by the people that were supposed to identify the Messiah, but who missed it. And he would be arrested by those he came to save, but they would arrest him and crucify him anyway. And like David, this is so fascinating, like David, he's been anointed by God, but not recognized. And like David, during this same meal, he would inaugurate a brand new covenant, not between God and the 12 tribes of Israel. He would introduce a brand new covenant. In fact, it's called the New Covenant. It's why we call the second half of our English Bibles the New Testament. He would initiate a brand new covenant between God and all of mankind, but not through the blood of an animal, but through his own blood. And in this moment, this is like the hinge moment in history between the time when he worked and functioned as a Jewish rabbi and miracle worker to the moment when it dawns on him in some crazy, mysterious way that perhaps he didn't know before. We don't know the answers to all that. But John says in this moment, he recognized that the end had come. He recognized that this was a very, very special moment. And here's what John said. Jesus knew, get this, Jesus knew that the Father had put, and I want us to read these two words out loud together, all things. One more time, all things. Jesus recognized that God had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. In this moment, Jesus has the power without the crown, the authority without the title. He's holding all the cards. He recognizes that God has put all things under his authority. And the text tells us, John tells us, so he got up. Now here's the question. What do you do when you're king? What do you do when you're the most powerful, influential person in the room? What do you do when you've got the whole world in your hands? And John says he got up. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist, and the disciples they couldn't believe it. There's so much emotion in this room. There's like a moan, there's a groan. In fact, Peter's gonna say, no, you're not doing that. We have people for that. We have slaves for that. We have servants for that. Put your clothes back on. You are not about to do what it looks like you're about to do. You are not about to wash our feet. You're a rabbi. You're our teacher. Besides, we've seen what you can do with those hands, and you're not about to use those hands to wash our feet. Jesus just smiled, ignored all of them. And after that, he poured water, the text tells us, into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. And then he put on his robe that showed, yes, he was a rabbi, that yes, he had authority. And he sat down, and I think he had a grin on his face, and I think nobody said a word because he didn't need to say anything. He had just preached the most powerful lesson that he would preach to that group of people. He had just done something that was so obvious what he meant by what he did that he didn't need to say anything, but he did say something. And maybe he said it for my benefit. Maybe he said it for your benefit. But they knew. He said, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. If I am not too good to wash your feet, you are not too good to wash one another's feet. So guys, he would say, and I think to me he says, and I think if you're a Jesus follower, to you he says, in those moments when you think you're something, in those moments when you think you're somebody, when someone hands you the keys, when they show you to the corner office, when you get the opportunity of a lifetime, when they set on your head the crown, in that moment, look for more feet to wash. Because perhaps the greatest reflection of our maturity, perhaps the thing that says more about our maturity than anything else, is what we do when we have authority, when we have power, when we have influence. Perhaps the thing that says more about you than anything else can be said about you is what you do when it dawns on you that you have the power, that you have the authority, that you have the influence. How we respond when it dawns on us that we are the most powerful person in the room, the locker room, the classroom, the boardroom, any room. And let's be honest, all right? If you attend one of our churches, and for many of you who watch online, for those of you who watch on television, for many of us, maybe for most of us, let's be honest. At some level, in some capacity, somebody's already handed us the keys, haven't they? Because you've got a title. For somebody, you wear a crown. You're a father. You're a mother. You're a husband. You're a wife. You're a manager. You're an owner. You're a captain of the team. Maybe you're just the big brother. You're the big sister. You're the president. You're a board member. You're a scheduler. You're an admin assistant. But you have authority. And we would do well to embrace the greatness that David learned the hard way and that Jesus modeled for us. That when you are the most powerful person in the room, you leverage your power for the benefit of the other people in the room. That when you're the most powerful person in the room, when you're the most powerful person in the relationship, you leverage your power for the benefit of the other people in the relationship. This is what David learned in the desert. This is what Jesus modeled for us. And if you are a Christian, this is required of you as it is required of me. Because after all, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Imagine if all of us with influence led that way. Imagine if all of us lived that way. History tells us that that kind of selflessness changed the world once, and perhaps it would again. When it dawns on you that you've got the power, that you've got the authority, that you've got the influence, look for a way to wash more feet. Look for a way to leverage that power, that authority, that influence for the benefit of the other people in the room. That's what your Savior did for you, for me. Heavenly Father, thank you for preserving this ancient text, and thank you for preserving these stories and all this narrative and all this detail. Thank you for the inspiration. We are all inspired to be better leaders. But Father, I pray for those of us who claim to be followers of your Son, that it would move from simply inspiration to something that we embrace with every fabric of our being, because this is what you didn't just model, this is what you did for us. So as we think about our responsibility, as we think about our influence, for those of us who have great influence, for those of us who have a little influence, for those of us that are just the big brother or the big sister, would you give each of us wisdom to know what to do with this text and with these stories and with the call of your Son to follow his example and to wash feet? So give us the wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard and the courage to do it in Jesus' name.
Amen. Don't forget to join us next week for week 5 of David as we close with David. On your seats, you've got the flyers for Heads versus Heart, the couples conference next week, Saturday. Make sure you take that with you. Give it to somebody that you know could do with that extra input in their relationships. And then tonight, mic drop at 6 o'clock, Kaleo's going to share his story. And he's sharing with us from his perspective of having everything that we would, as people, say, this is what I strive for, this is what I want to achieve in my life. And then getting to that point where he said, is this really it? And how does this compare to my relationship with God? And what matters most? So come and join us this evening as he shares from that perspective of where he is and how he's journeyed through that process. So that's 6 o'clock tonight. And we close the way we do because love is the way, Amen.